Picture this. June 14th, 1645. A shroud of mist clings to the fields of Northamptonshire, cold and damp, muffling every sound. In the ghostly quiet of dawn, an entire kingdom holds its breath. Near the small village of Naseby, two armies stand facing each other across the rolling English countryside. They are not just soldiers, they are symbols of two Englands, two destinies, and two irreconcilable visions of what power means. On one ridge stands King Charles I, proud yet cornered. He believes his authority is divine, his crown sanctified by heaven itself. With him are roughly 10,000 men, the Royalists, the Cavaliers. They are brave, noble, and weary. Their silks and plumed hats may glitter, but beneath the finery lie months of hardship, hunger, and shattered hopes. They fight for loyalty, for the traditions of crown and church, and for a king who still thinks rebellion is sin. Across the valley, the new England waits. 14,000 men under Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell, Parliament's new model army, stand in grim formation. No gilded armor or feathered helmets here. These are professionals, drilled and paid, clad in plain red coats, their pikes glinting like a forest of steel. They are not fighting for bloodlines or divine right. They fight for Parliament, for reform, for a future where no man stands above the law. To their Puritan hearts, this is not merely a battle. It is a crusade. As the fog lifts and the morning light breaks through, the silence ends with the beat of a single drum. The stillness fractures. The Battle of Naseby has begun. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the king's daring and impetuous nephew, wastes no time. His cavalry, 1,500 strong, launch forward in a thunderous charge, the ground trembling under their hooves. They crash into the parliamentarian left flank like a tidal wave of steel and fury. Muskets flash, pikes splinter, and the line buckles. For a moment, the Royalist cry of God and the King rises above the din. Victory seems within reach. But Rupert's fatal flaw is pride. Swept up in the thrill of the charge, he drives his horsemen too far. Instead of regrouping, they gallop in pursuit of fleeing parliamentarians, overrunning the enemy baggage train, looting and celebrating, oblivious to the chaos unfolding behind them. The Royalist right is now exposed, its flank naked to the enemy. And waiting on the opposite ridge is Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell, the country squire turned general, rides at the head of his Ironsides, disciplined cavalry, hardened by years of war and the conviction that they fight for God's will. He watches Rupert's reckless charge disappear into the distance, then gives the order. His men move as one, a wall of iron and resolve. They recite psalms as they ride, their voices carrying over the thunder of hooves and the crack of musket fire. When Cromwell's Ironsides strike the Royalist flank, they do not break ranks or chase glory. They hit like a hammer, regroup, and strike again. Each charge is precise, coordinated, merciless. The Cavaliers, brave but disordered, begin to fall apart under the relentless assault. Panic spreads. The Royalist infantry, already weary, cannot withstand the relentless assault. Within hours, the king's army is collapsing. By midday, the field of Broadmoor is a slaughterhouse. The red coats of the new model army advance steadily across ground littered with the fallen, men and horses tangled in the mud. The once proud Royalist banners lie trampled underfoot. Thousands are dead or captured. King Charles flees the field, his dream of victory shattered beyond repair. But the true devastation of Naseby is not only on the battlefield. Among the captured spoils, parliamentarian soldiers discover the king's private letters, his secret communications with foreign Catholic powers, begging for troops and gold to crush his own people. The discovery is catastrophic. To his enemies, it is irrefutable proof of treachery. The king who claimed divine guidance had been willing to invite invasion. He had not defended England. He had conspired against it.
The Battle of Naseby was more than a military defeat. It was the moment when Charles I lost not only his army, but his legitimacy. His authority as a divinely appointed ruler was stripped away by musket and ink alike. What began as a civil war over governance had become something far more radical. The notion that a king could be tried, judged, and executed by his subjects. In the months that followed, Royalist resistance crumbled. The king's strongholds fell one by one. He would eventually surrender, stand trial, and meet his fate on a cold January morning in 1649 beneath the blade of the executioner's axe. The monarchy itself was abolished. England had become a republic, an unimaginable idea only a decade before. Yet, from the mud and blood of Naseby, a new political reality emerged. The new model army proved that faith, discipline, and conviction could triumph over privilege and birthright. The battle did not simply end a war, it redefined what authority meant. The divine right of kings gave way to the rights of men and the power of Parliament. Still, the victory came at a price. The fields of Naseby were soaked not just with blood, but with the anguish of a nation divided. Families torn apart, cities ruined, faith weaponized. The scars of this war would echo through centuries of English politics, through revolutions, restorations, and reformations yet to come. So, the question lingers: was Cromwell's victory the dawn of liberty, or the birth of tyranny in another form? Did the redcoats of the new model army march for freedom, or for a new kind of rule cloaked in godly zeal? History, as ever, leaves us with no easy answer. But one truth endures: On that misty June morning in 1645, in the fields around a sleepy English village, the world changed.
Part 1. Setup. The Road to Ruin. By the spring of 1645, England was eating itself alive. What had begun 3 years earlier as a quarrel between king and parliament had metastasized into something darker, a national suicide, a war without mercy or end. The Civil War had torn across shires and towns, from Yorkshire's heaths to the rolling fields of the Midlands, turning fields of wheat into graveyards. Brother fought brother, fathers disowned sons. Whole villages chose sides and then burned for it. King Charles I still clung to his vision of kingship, a divine mandate uncorrupted by the will of commoners. His court at Oxford remained a flickering torch of royal authority, even as his kingdom crumbled around him. He had endured crushing blows before, stalemates at Edgehill in 1642, disasters at Marston Moor in 1644, but he had always survived, buoyed by faith, cunning, and the lingering loyalty of men who still believed in crowns and crosses. But survival was no longer enough. His armies were fracturing, his coffers empty, and his allies divided. Wales and the West still pledged him fealty, yet Scotland had turned against him, and Ireland was aflame. The King's Oxford army, once the pride of Royalist might, was a ghost of its former self. 10,000 men at best, brave but weary, hungry and unpaid. Their commander, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, fearless, impetuous, and adored by his cavalry, was as brilliant as he was reckless. For every battlefield victory his charges had seized, his arrogance had lost another. On the other side, Parliament was reaching the breaking point. Its own war effort had become mired in factionalism. Presbyterians versus independents, politicians versus soldiers. The armies were often peers and lords who led with lineage, not logic. Armies were raised, disbanded, and raised again. Campaigns sputtered out for lack of coordination or conviction. Even as the people suffered under endless taxation and billeting, victory seemed no closer. Parliament's patience snapped. In the winter of 1645, they gambled everything on a revolution within the revolution. They tore down the old command structure and built something new, a single, unified, national army, a machine, the new model army. 22,000 men, drilled and paid by the state, loyal not to local lords, but to Parliament itself. Its officers were chosen not for birth, but for merit. And its soldiers were not mercenaries, but believers. They fought for a cause, for liberty, for God's justice, for a vision of England purified of tyranny and corruption. At its head stood Sir Thomas Fairfax, calm, capable, the perfect professional soldier. But the true spirit of the new model army lay in his Lieutenant General of Cavalry, Oliver Cromwell. Stern-faced and iron-willed, Cromwell was no aristocrat. A country squire turned zealot, he saw this war as divine judgment upon a sinful nation. His soldiers, God's Ironsides, reflected his own relentless faith. They prayed before battle, sang psalms in the saddle, and cut down their enemies without hesitation. Cromwell's credo was simple: discipline, devotion, and divine purpose.
I had rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for, than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else."
The creation of the new model army changed everything. It was modern, mobile, and merciless, a professional fighting force unlike anything England had ever seen. While the king's men still relied on gallantry and charisma, the parliamentarians turned war into calculation and craft. By May, the two worlds were set on a collision course. Desperate to reignite his campaign, Charles ordered his forces north, capturing and brutally sacking the parliamentarian stronghold of Leicester. It was a fleeting triumph, but one that filled him with dangerous confidence. To the people of England, it was proof that the old lion still had claws. To Parliament, it was the spark of vengeance. Fairfax lifted his siege of Oxford, the Royalist capital, and turned his army northward in pursuit. For weeks, the two forces danced across the Midlands, shadowing, skirmishing, watching. Scouts traded musket fire in hedgerows. Villages cowered as columns of soldiers thundered past, looting what the last army hadn't already taken. The land itself seemed to groan under the weight of war. On June 13th, the dance ended. Near the quiet hamlet of Naseby, Parliament scouts stumbled into the Royalist vanguard in the fading light. Shots cracked across the moor, echoing like the drumbeat of fate. The King's Council convened in panic, urging withdrawal to Oxford to preserve the army. But Charles would not run. He had given them their liberties, and they will not let me enjoy mine. His pride and his faith would not allow retreat. So he chose to fight. That night, two armies made camp within sight of each other, their campfires winking across the dark fields like watchful stars. From the Royalist ridge near Dust Hill, the king could see the glimmer of parliamentarian fires to the north. Drums thudded faintly in the mist. Men whispered prayers, sharpened swords, and waited. Across the moor, the soldiers of the new model knelt in the wet grass, their red coats dark against the fog, murmuring psalms under their breath. One army fought for the past, a world of kings and privilege, the other for a dangerous, untested future. Rule by Parliament, by conscience, by God alone. Between them stretched the fields of Naseby, silent beneath the moonlight, ready to drink the blood of a nation. At dawn, the fog would lift, and with it, the last illusion that England could ever be the same again. Part 2. Armies assemble. Forces and formations. At first light on June 14, 1645, the mists over Northamptonshire rolled back like a curtain rising on the final act of a national tragedy. The fields near Naseby, sodden from the night's dew, shimmered faintly beneath the pale dawn. In that spectral calm, two armies stood facing each other, two visions of England embodied in flesh and steel. From his vantage point on the rise above the fields, Sir Thomas Fairfax surveyed his lines with the calm precision of a man who knew this day might decide not only the war, but the fate of monarchy itself. He had chosen his ground with care. The new model army occupied the high ridge near the village of Naseby, a commanding position overlooking the valley below. The slope before them was gentle but treacherous, soft turf and uneven ground that would sap the momentum of any cavalry charge. To Fairfax, it was perfect killing ground. Below him, 14,000 men stood in ordered ranks, a human engine of discipline and faith. The center formed the backbone of this machine, 7,000 infantry, commanded by the grizzled veteran Philip Skippon, a soldier forged in decades of continental warfare. His men, clad in red coats and steel morions, were the embodiment of the new English professionalism. Each regiment was a self-contained organism of pike and musket, files 6 deep, ready to fire in volleys, reload, and hold the line under any storm. Skippon himself, calm and paternal, rode before his men, reminding them to pray heartily and fight manfully. His command was the anvil upon which Cromwell's hammer would fall. The flanks held the cavalry, the new model's most devastating weapon. On the left, Henry Ireton, Cromwell's stern and scholarly son-in-law, marshaled 3,000 horse and dragoons. His task, to absorb the inevitable onslaught of Prince Rupert's vaunted Cavaliers. But on the right, the right, that was where destiny gathered its thunder. There stood Oliver Cromwell, his armor plain and unadorned, his eyes burning with conviction. His 3,500 Ironsides were the soul of the army, small farmers, craftsmen, and God-fearing zealots who believed themselves instruments of divine will. They fought not for plunder or pay, but for providence. They sang psalms in formation, their steady voices rising in eerie harmony across the moor as the morning sun broke through the fog. Cromwell had drilled them into something England had never seen before: cavalry that fought, not in wild charges, but with discipline, reserve, and ruthless coordination. He had turned faith into formation, and faith would soon ride like a storm.
Fairfax's cunning touch lay in his hidden card. Along the Solby hedges, thick with hawthorn and bramble on his left flank, he placed Colonel John Oakey's 600 dragoons, mounted infantry armed with short muskets. Concealed in the greenery, they were ghosts waiting to strike. When Rupert's cavalry swept down, as everyone knew they would, Oakey's men would unleash a storm of fire into their flanks, breaking the charge before it began. It was a masterstroke of anticipation, and it would prove decisive. Across the shallow valley, the Royalist army stood arrayed on Dust Hill, their banners fluttering in the early breeze. Their campfires still smoldered behind them, and their prayer tents were empty now, the chaplains having already blessed the field. The king's host was smaller, barely 10,000 strong, but it carried the weight of royal destiny on its shoulders. At its heart stood King Charles I, watching from a reserve position behind the line. To his supporters, he was still the anointed sovereign, God's chosen ruler. Yet to many on the field, his presence was a double-edged sword, an inspiration, yes, but also a chain of pride that forbade retreat or caution. Around him clustered courtiers and guardsmen, their armor gleaming, but hearts heavy. The center was entrusted to Lord Astley, an old and loyal soldier who had fought in every campaign of the war. His 4,000 foot soldiers were brave but worn down, drawn from garrisons and counties that had already bled dry. To stretch their line to match Fairfax's, Astley had deployed them only 3 ranks deep, a perilously thin formation. They could deliver a single withering volley, but if their momentum faltered, they would crumble under the new model's layered firepower. It was a gamble born of necessity. The cavalry, the pride of the Royalists, carried the kingdom's last hope. On the right, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the king's nephew, war-hardened, impulsive, and impossibly brave, commanded 2,500 Cavaliers. Their silks and plumes belied their exhaustion. Months of constant campaigning had worn down both men and mounts. Still, Rupert's reputation alone inspired terror. His lightning charges had shattered enemy lines at Edgehill and Bristol, and he was certain he could do so again. On the left, Sir Marmaduke Langdale commanded the Northern Horse, another 2,500 riders, less brilliant but steadfast and battle-tested. Between them, they hoped to envelop the new model's flanks and crush it before its superior numbers could be brought to bear. Yet, as the sun climbed higher, the contrast between the two armies was stark. The Royalists gleamed with the trappings of chivalry, sashes, ribbons, and gilt cuirasses catching the light. Across the field, the parliamentarians stood grim and plain, their red coats uniform and unadorned, their discipline unbroken. The Cavaliers fought for a king, the Roundheads fought for a cause. From one ridge to the other, the wind carried the sounds of preparation, the thud of drums, the creak of cannon carriages, the clink of steel being tested in nervous hands. Officers rode down the lines, murmuring final orders and prayers. Drummers beat the call to arms. In that tense half-hour before battle, silence fell again, a silence so deep it seemed the land itself was holding its breath. Fairfax raised his telescope. Across the valley, he could see Rupert's cavalry shifting into motion, the sun glinting off drawn sabers. He turned to his officers. He said, "Gentlemen, the Lord of Hosts will decide this day." Below, the ranks straightened. On one side, the last army of kings. On the other, the first army of the modern age. And between them lay the misting fields of Naseby, waiting to swallow an empire.
Part 3. The clash begins. Rupert's charge and chaos. 9 a.m., June 14th, 1645. A low trumpet note cut through the morning haze, followed by the answering blast of drums. Then, like a living tide, the Royalist line began to move. The still air filled with the rhythmic clatter of armor, the creak of harnesses, the muffled prayers of men about to wager their souls. For a heartbeat, the whole valley seemed to hold its breath. Then the thunder began. Down the slope of Dust Hill, the Royalist host advanced, banners snapping in the wind, steel catching the sunlight. From a distance, it looked magnificent, an army of kings, resplendent in sashes of crimson and gold. But the grandeur could not mask their peril. They were climbing uphill into the teeth of Parliament's guns. On the Royalist right, Prince Rupert led the charge. He was the very image of war's reckless glamour, his plumed hat streaming behind him, his sword aloft, his great black dog, Boy, bounding beside his horse. Around him, 2,000 Cavaliers spurred forward in a torrent of speed and fury. Their sabers flashed like sunlight on water, hooves drumming a rhythm of death across the open field. As they swept past Sulby hedges, the hidden trap was sprung. From the thick brush, Colonel Oakey's 600 dragoons rose like ghosts, muskets blazing. The air filled with the crack of gunfire and the screams of falling men and horses. Rupert's vanguard staggered under the volley, yet still they came on, their momentum unstoppable. The dragoons melted back, having done their work. The Royalists were disordered, bleeding before they even struck home. And then they hit. Rupert's charge slammed into Henry Ireton's cavalry with the force of a hurricane. The parliamentarian left reeled under the impact. Swords flashed, pistols fired at point-blank range, and the air was filled with the clangor of steel and the neighing of terrified horses. Ireton himself was wounded and captured, his men driven backward in chaos. The parliamentarian flank crumpled, the red line tearing apart. For a dazzling instant, Rupert had done it. He had smashed the enemy wing. The field seemed his for the taking. But triumph turned to folly. In that fatal heartbeat, when discipline was needed most, Rupert's Cavalier blood betrayed him. Instead of regrouping to strike the now exposed parliamentarian center, he yielded to instinct, the thrill of pursuit. With a jubilant shout, he and his men galloped off the field, chasing the fleeing enemy for miles, plundering baggage trains and glory. Behind him, the king's infantry fought on alone. The hammer had struck, but the anvil was gone. In the center, Lord Astley's foot soldiers pressed grimly uphill, banners waving beneath drifting smoke. "For God and the King," they cried, their voices swallowed by the thunder of muskets. Philip Skippon's infantry met them in disciplined ranks, pikes leveled, firing by rotation in murderous precision. The exchange was brutal, deafening, and pitiless. Skippon himself was hit in the side by a musket ball. Blood seeped through his armor, yet he refused to fall back. "Men," he shouted through gritted teeth, "I am wounded, but not slain. Stand fast and fight it out." His steadiness anchored the line. The Royalist advances faltered. Their thin formations, stretched too far, began to waver under the disciplined volleys of Parliament's musketeers. Smoke thickened into a blinding fog, and through it the Royalist flags began to drift backward.
Then on the far right, Oliver Cromwell moved. He had waited like a hunter in tall grass, silent and calculating. Before him, Sir Marmaduke Langdale's northern horse were forming for the charge. Valiant men, but weary, their mounts underfed and their spirits brittle. Cromwell's Ironsides, by contrast, stood motionless. To them, this was not chaos, it was judgment. He waited until Langdale's men were within 40 yards, their faces visible, their cries audible over the din. Then, and only then, Cromwell lifted his sword. "Now, forward, in the name of the Lord!" The Ironsides surged ahead, a crimson tide of precision and fury. Their formation held tight as a fist. As they closed, the sound of their psalm singing rose, steady, solemn, terrible.
The two cavalries met with a crash that echoed across the valley. Langdale's riders reeled, struck by an iron discipline they could neither match nor break. Within minutes, the northern horse was shattered, scattering into the fields. But Cromwell did not lose himself in the chase. Here lay his genius. He halted the pursuit, reined in his troops, and wheeled his regiments with clockwork precision. Where Rupert had galloped to glory, Cromwell turned to annihilation. With ruthless economy, he divided his force. One squadron to keep the fugitives at bay, the other to pivot and strike the exposed flank of the Royalist infantry. Across the blood-choked field, the blue-coated Ironsides came thundering in, slamming into Astley's flank just as Skippon's battered lines surged forward from the front. The effect was catastrophic. Royalist order dissolved in moments. Surrounded, cut down and leaderless, their proud banners fell one by one. "God with us!" cried the parliamentarian ranks as they advanced through the smoke. A modern animated map would show it with cruel simplicity. Rupert's red arrow vanishing off the field, while Cromwell's blue lines swing like a closing door around the trapped Royalist corps. As historian Patrick Little observes, unlike Rupert, Cromwell kept his reserves in hand, turning local success into total victory. By noon, the once proud Royalist army was disintegrating into panic. The King's Lifeguard made a brave, doomed stand before being cut down. Around them, pikes snapped, drums fell silent, and the ground ran red with royal blood. In just 3 hours, the world had changed.
Part 4. The Breaking Point. Encirclement and Slaughter. By late morning, the Royalist centre had completely disintegrated. Cromwell's Ironsides, having already smashed one flank with relentless precision, now swept around the rear of Lord Astley's beleaguered infantry. Simultaneously, Fairfax pushed forward from the front, coordinating volleys of musket fire and pike thrusts. The Royalist foot soldiers were ensnared in a vice of disciplined violence, their formations crumbling under pressure from both front and rear. King Charles I, observing the unraveling catastrophe from his reserve, contemplated a last, desperate gamble. Drawing his sword, he prepared to lead his personal lifeguard into a suicidal charge straight into the heart of the battle. The scene was cinematic, the monarch alone, sword raised, defiance in his eyes. Yet his advisors, aware that such heroism would be futile, intervened. The Scottish Earl of Carnwath reportedly seized the bridle of Charles's horse, pleading, "Sire, will you go upon your death?" The moment slipped away, and the king's final chance for personal valor dissolved into inaction. Without their leader to rally them, the remaining Royalist infantry, bluecoats, Welsh levies, and loyal remnants fought with desperate courage. Surrounded, exhausted, and outnumbered, they eventually surrendered in overwhelming numbers. The battlefield, once alive with the roar of battle, descended into grim silence, punctuated by the cries of the defeated. Prince Rupert returned from his reckless pursuit to find a shattered army. His cavalry, spent from hours of chasing fleeing soldiers, faced not victory but devastation. The king was in retreat, the army broken, and the field dominated by disciplined parliamentarian forces. Amid the chaos, parliamentarian troops swept through the Royalist baggage train. In a tragic misjudgment, fueled by fear and frenzy,
Nearly 100 female camp followers were slaughtered, mistaken for Irish Catholic auxiliaries, a haunting reminder of war's indiscriminate brutality. Yet the most consequential discovery lay within the captured baggage, Charles's private cabinet of letters. These documents revealed secret negotiations with foreign powers, plans to raise Irish Catholic troops, and attempts to subvert his own parliamentarian subjects. Military defeat had shattered his army, but the exposure of his duplicity shattered his legitimacy entirely. By the end of the day, the field was strewn with the dead and dying, a charnel ground of splintered pikes, broken standards, and trampled colors. Approximately 1,000 Royalists lay dead, and another 4,500 were captured, representing nearly the entirety of the King's veteran infantry. Parliamentarian casualties numbered a mere 400. The Battle of Naseby was more than a tactical victory. It was the effective annihilation of the Royalist cause, marking the point of no return in the English Civil War and signaling the inexorable rise of parliamentarian supremacy.
Part 5. Aftermath and Legacy. A Kingdom Shattered. The Reckoning. The Battle of Naseby was more than a military defeat. It was the death knell for the Royalist cause. In a single brutal morning, King Charles I lost everything that sustained his war effort: his veteran infantry, the backbone of his army, the entire artillery train, and any hope of turning the tide. The king himself became a fugitive, retreating first to Wales and then attempting to rally support elsewhere. But the die was cast. By 1646, surrender was inevitable. His cause was broken beyond repair. Yet, the military catastrophe was only part of the story. The captured letters, seized from Charles's baggage train and rapidly published by Parliament under the title "The King's Cabinet Opened," revealed a web of duplicity. The monarch had been secretly negotiating with foreign Catholic powers, attempting to raise Irish troops to suppress his own people. These documents transformed Charles from a political adversary into a figure of outright treachery, undermining the notion of divine right and fueling Parliament's propaganda machine. The king's credibility and authority crumbled overnight. The legacy. The repercussions of Naseby extended far beyond the battlefield. Firstly, it established the new model army as a revolutionary military force. Its combination of professional discipline, meritocratic leadership, and ideological cohesion created a template for the modern standing army. Soldiers were no longer aristocratic retainers or mercenaries. They were a national force, united by training, loyalty, and purpose. The echoes of Naseby's military innovation can be traced through centuries of British and global military organization. Secondly, the battle paved the way for a political revolution. With Charles's authority irreparably undermined, Parliament seized the initiative, ultimately leading to the unprecedented trial and execution of the king in 1649. Naseby did not merely end a war, it ended the notion of absolute monarchy in England, setting a precedent that sovereigns could be held accountable to their people. The battlefield became the crucible in which the modern principles of parliamentary sovereignty and constitutional governance were forged. However, the victory carried profound costs. Families were torn apart,
Towns and countryside lay devastated, and the economy teetered on collapse. The social fabric of England had been rent, leaving scars that would last for generations. Naseby was both a beginning and an end, the forge of a new political order, and a stark reminder of the human price of civil war. The blood spilled on that misty Northamptonshire morning reshaped the trajectory of England forever.
Conclusion. So, the final judgment is yours. What truly decided the fate of England on that mist-shrouded June morning? Was it the reckless audacity of Prince Rupert, whose chase left the Royalist centre exposed and doomed the King's army? Or was it the iron-willed discipline of Cromwell's Ironsides, a force forged from faith, drill, and unshakable purpose? Perhaps it was the cool-headed strategy of Fairfax, orchestrating his army with precision, or the relentless combination of ideology and professionalism that defined Parliament's new model army. The Battle of Naseby was not won by chance. It was a collision of tactics, temperament, and conviction, a turning point where the old world of chivalry and divine right yielded to the harsh logic of a new military and political order. The clash was brutal, bloody, and decisive, but its ripples extended far beyond the battlefield. The monarchy would never again wield unchecked power, and the notion of a sovereign accountable to the people had taken root. We want to hear your verdict. Was it pride or discipline, faith or strategy that changed history? Debate it in the comments below. If this deep dive into the bloody birth of a new Britain captivated you, show your support. Like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for more tales of battles that shaped our world. This was Naseby, where swords clashed, ideals collided, and a kingdom's future was written in blood. Until next time, keep your formations tight